Hello viewers and listeners, my name is Matt Berman and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sonar. We help businesses communicate with their customers on mobile messaging channels such as SMS and Facebook Messenger, and welcome to the SonarCast. During SonarCasts, we invite industry leaders and innovators to talk about messaging apps, AI, and bots, and how they relate to business to consumer messaging. So I'm extremely excited to welcome Chris Messina, who's been a leading voice in conversational commerce and business to consumer messaging. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, man.
Chris currently holds the developer experience lead position at Uber and has been a contributor on pivotal pieces of technology such as OAuth, Firefox, and the Google Developer Program. He's extremely bullish on business to consumer messaging. He actually invented the hashtag, he coined the conversational commerce word, and we're extremely excited to have him here today to talk about it all. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks.
A lot of what's happening in the US with regards to messaging has already happened in Asia with WeChat and other messaging apps. They're a few years ahead of us, and predictions say that we're continuing the trend of following what's happened in Asia. Are there cultural differences that need to be considered when we're thinking about how the US will be adopting different messaging technologies?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on the Asian market, but you're right. Messaging has been a huge part of their usage and adoption of just the internet. And there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, if you think about just the way that the internet works and is accessed in China, it's a much more restricted platform. Whereas in the United States, of course, it came out of our military and then became adopted by our educational institutions, and it became a network effectively for sharing information. And so that's kind of like where it was for a long time. And then slowly we've built these application frameworks on top of that document platform. And that sort of gave rise to, and then eventually became the sort of underpinnings of what more modern, touchscreen devices sort of allow people to access information through. So if you look at that rise, it's a very different sort of source of, use cases than Asia. I think Asia particularly sort of skipped a lot of the desktop era in terms of mass adoption and usage, and went straight into mobile devices. And so as a result of that, the primary thing that you want to really do on a mobile device is, of course, talk to other people. I mean, that's true of the internet in terms of BBSs and stuff like that. But if you start with mobile devices first, then chances are you're going to be talking to other people through that platform. The thing that also happened that I think is really important and different, again, in Asia, is that, as I understand it, Chinese citizens, you have these government IDs or credentials that they can use to do various things through messaging, like pay for the laundry or their rent, or they can buy cars and stuff like that. Whereas web and mobile payments in the United States has actually been fairly slow to gain widespread adoption. I think there's a lot of just skepticism of the safety of the internet, and so we've been very reluctant to use it. Whereas in other cultures, there's been just a move for the convenience of that platform. Furthermore, in those countries, credit cards and banking isn't as common as it is here, and so you would pay for things, with mobile minutes or things like that telcos would provide, and so their entire infrastructure and relationship to service providers was mediated through very different entities than there were in the United States. And regulations in the United States also affected what different businesses and companies could actually do and what kind of businesses they could engage in. So there's an entire, I think, environmental difference that's not just cultural, that defines why messaging is so powerful in Asia, but it's also very different in terms of the way in which platforms are grown and built. As I understand it, again, WeChat has a much more sort of centralized program for building apps, whereas here, with the web and things like that, we've tried to make these platforms much more open. We sort of give permission freely. People can build on them without asking for permission first, and that isn't the case in a lot of cases in Asia. So innovation happens in a very different way there, and I guess just the sort of mindset is different than what we see in Silicon Valley, where there's a lot of co-opetition and different ideas about how and when and why you would use different digital services.
So in China, for example, with WeChat, people are extremely familiar and used to actually doing entire transactions through this platform, and they're talking to not only their friends and family, but they're also talking to businesses.
Yeah.
Is that we're seeing that start to happen here. Do you think the adoption will be fast in the US with actually doing purchases and being really familiar and comfortable with talking to businesses over these channels?
I actually think it's going to be pretty messy for a little while. I think, again, in Asia, you kind of have to be on WeChat, like to do anything, to buy things in stores. Like everyone kind of, as I understand it, again, I've only been to Asia once or China once. When you go into a store, the first thing that you tend to do is sort of, scan like the WeChat code or whatever, the QR code, to find that business and then start to do, interactions with them, whether that's customer service or whether it's payments and so on. In our case, because we have so many choices, whether it's cash, whether it's credit cards, whether it's like checks, whether it's like all these different things, and given the way that banking works here as well, there's not going to be the same sort of need or motivation for either end user customers or businesses to sort of move right away. Now that said, those businesses that do and get there early and start to really understand both the opportunities and the needs of their customers and how to operate in these spaces in ways that feel very natural and native and learn and grow and build as these platforms, specifically like Messenger, get built out. I think that they'll be in a pretty privileged position, in 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years, especially as millennials and the next generation kind of like come of age and go through college. There's a lot of just, if you sort of think back to the early days of the web, 2003, 2004, a lot of us were using Napster and other things like that to learn how to like do file sharing and like social networking and stuff like that. We're at a similar point, I think, for messaging in the United States where people are using, for example, Telegram to like share a lot of legal files and things like that. But young people who are engaged in those behaviors are then learning the behaviors that then will translate into what they do when they become sort of adults and like of the sort of business, like legitimate world. Which means there'll be sort of a very, it'll be hard to sort of feel, but a very slow shift of the underbelly of internet commerce away from like the web and onto more and more mobile devices and screens. And people are going to expect very discrete types of purchasing abilities. Anytime I see something that I think is cool on like Instagram, I should be able to buy it. And maybe that means going through direct messaging on Instagram. Maybe that means going into Messenger to actually complete the purchase.
Right.
So I think that that's maybe the way to think about it, is that we're moving away from the locus of this centralized website where you aggregate all of your products and services and things like that into more conversational contexts where people discover products and then want to actually transact with you.
So it sounds like in the US at least, whichever messaging app figures out payments well is going to be the leader and going to be the winner.
It's not just about payments, because there's several apps that do it already. I mean, Venmo has been doing sort of messaging and payments for a while, but they're not really a messaging app per se.
Right.
People don't go to it to just talk to their friends. So it has to be a number of things where you've got the right amount of behavior, you've got the right volume of behavior, you've got the right sort of ease of use, you've got the right amount of openness so that anybody can kind of like hop on and start paying for things, but you also have to have other types of controls in place like spam and fraud abuse.
Right.
Businesses are not going to want to move over to Messenger if 4 to 5 to 8% of their transaction volume is all fraudulent, right? And I'm not saying that that's the number, but I'm just saying like that's one of the things to consider. And so if you do a comparison, let's say between Messenger and Kik has a lot of teenagers. Teenagers are going to start learning to pay with what's the currency that they have? Anyway, sort of like a digital currency, as opposed to like dollars and cents. And if they learn that behavior may be one that they want to take with them to whatever the next platform is that they use. Right. So I think it's too facile to say, well, whoever nails payments and messaging is going to win. Messenger already has it, and a number of the other platforms have it too. Skype has it, Snapchat has it. It's more like when people are in that moment where they're about to buy or purchase something, do they think of staying in that channel and executing that transaction versus going to some other channel?
So, Chris, how do you think messaging apps specifically are going to change in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so it's a big question. I mean, we're in 2016, the middle of 2016, the year of conversational commerce, and you think back to 2011 and like what was going on in 2011. And I mean, if you think back even before that, you go back to 2007. 2007 was the year when the iPhone came out, so it's almost 10 years ago. And that was also the year that Facebook launched its platform. So if you fast forward like 4 or 5 years, I think that was right around, when did Instagram come out? I think Instagram was 2009. Snapchat might have been 2012. Anyways, so it's very hard to say. My intuition tells me that a couple things are happening. One is that the number of services, and I'll call them services because it's not really about apps, the number of services that people will engage with that have some strong digital component are going to increase. And the number and times that you're going to interact with those digital services is also going to increase. However, the amount of time that you spend with each digital service needs to, overall, just by definition, go down. Right? Because you only have so much time and attention available in any given day. And so those services which are asking for and demanding more attention than they really warrant, I think are going to become more cumbersome and more frictionful, such that you're not going to want to spend time with them. And so what messaging represents is a broad shift away from what I would consider to be very kind of like focused, intent computing that occupies all of your attention. Messaging allows us to move away from the desktop and keyboard and mouse paradigm of computing, which came out of the office world and the sort of enterprise space. And it allows computing to now go with us wherever we are and to interact with services in an asynchronous way. So in this way, we're starting to renegotiate our relationship to technology. And rather than having us kind of lean towards the computer to kind of figure out how to express ourselves in a way that the computer can understand, we are now on the verge of software and technology getting smarter through AI, advanced learning techniques, natural language understanding and processing, computer vision, all these sort of advanced things that take a lot of data and a lot of processing power, to the point where the computing apparatus, sort of, in the extensions of man, Marshall McLuhan sense, are starting to lean towards us. And so we can go about our day, do the things that we want to do, and suddenly we have access to a huge amount of information, and not just information that's sort of like dumb facts, but insights that become actionable. And we can start to make requests of the system through messaging to do things on our behalf. And I mean, just a simple example of this, you asked, what is messaging going to look like in 5 years? Well, as it is today, you and I can be talking in a messenger thread, and you might mention like, hey, come down to WeWork in San Francisco, and on that little speech bubble is a request a ride from Uber annotation. That type of insight, that type of awareness, that type of anticipation of what my next intention or next action might be, I think is going to be incredibly powerful. And so today, a lot of those integrations are happening largely in text-based form because those are easy for computers to understand. Right. But increasingly, those things will also be available through voice-based interactions. So, for example, you can now order an Uber like through Siri or through Alexa and the Amazon Echo, through third-party voice apps like Houndify. And so we're bringing in these superpowers into people's lives in places and contexts where we wouldn't previously have thought. And so I think like that's the meta trend, is like there's all this smarts and all this intelligence out there, and now there are all these APIs and all these services that are being broken up into smaller discrete units, and they're meeting people where they are in the moment when they need them, even if they don't even know about the service existing.
Now that makes a lot of sense, and I'm wondering, why are you so bullish that the conversational interface is the right way to go? Now you also mentioned voice, so I want to hear a little bit about that, but it feels like the text-based conversational interface is really the future, at least for the next few years. Why do you think that is? Well,
I want to be careful about something. Like when I think of conversations, I actually think of like multimodal conversations. The conversational commerce insight really is about understanding that there's this huge volume of messages that people are sending to their friends and family, and that behavior is one that feels very natural and normal and native to the mobile context. And so if that's true, and you imagine that there's a whole bunch of people who are getting their first mobile devices for the very first time in their lives, their first computing experience is going to be through messaging. Their next question will be, well, why can't I message a business or a service? Right. And so if the service is available through that means, then they can start having those conversations and interactions in a way that feels very normal to them. So it might be text, but it might also be voice. The thing is, humans are very good at communicating with partial meaning. Essentially, as you and I have a conversation, you may have no idea what I'm talking about. But the more that we talk, we're negotiating meaning in this shared context and space. And so In the previous kind of era of computing, let's say the Google era, you would sit there in a search box and you would type a bunch of random things until you kind of guessed at what the computer thought was what you actually wanted. It would give you like a series of 10 blue links, and it was like going to like the slot machine, just hoping that you pulled the right lever. Now you can actually have sort of a back and forth dialogue in a way that scales for many, many millions of users, and allows for there to be incremental improvement and clarity on getting to whatever your intention actually is.
Right. So sorry.
And so I think that's much more natural for people. It's there's much less cognitive overhead, and people are able to kind of guess at and move through their interactions with technology in a way that's more forgiving. So I think that when I talk about conversational software, that's what I'm thinking about. It's more the forgivability as opposed to the explicit types of UI elements that are very declarative, and in other words require a user to go and push a button, wait, push another button, wait, see a form, fill out the form, and all of those things are designed so that there's very little ambiguity in the user's expression towards the computer. So I guess I feel like the opportunity is to really try to move in a way that makes computing just a lot simpler and easier for people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's basically, instead of me trying to figure out what input is going to get the result that I want out of the computer, it's actually the computer trying to figure out what I mean by what I'm trying to say.
And it's looking at all the patterns and all the data that it's previously collected. And it turns out that we're, as much as we like to think of ourselves as snowflakes, there's a lot of sort of common behaviors and common use cases. And if the computer system has previously solved this problem for someone else or solved something that's very close to what it is that you want to do, then it just sort of finds that pathway and then proposes it. And if the user is like, no, that's not it, it's more like this, then it starts to learn and shape in a slightly different way. Now, obviously, there's a certain point at which you get very frustrated. And I see this already with a lot of bots where two of the first questions is like, hey, how's it going? Like, where are you? I'm like, what do you mean, where am I? Like, my phone knows where I am, like, Facebook knows where I am, like, why is this information not relayed? And then, secondly, it's like what's your time zone, or like things like that, like basic sort of metadata about my experience. And of course, right now, this is really, I think the platforms are being very conservative because they want to be very protective and they don't want people to feel exposed. And there's not a lot of clarity around the ethics of how bots should behave, but that's just sort of an example of these rote kind of experiences that will eventually sort of, I think, become, part of, we won't worry about those basic things as much.
Great. So, Chris, this is a question that I'm really excited to hear from you is, what do you think the best use case for bots is right now?
Yeah. This is still very TBD, I think. I think even Facebook doesn't have a clear idea about the best use cases, though they just came out with something today with some interesting examples. And if you think about bots more as kind of a product, right? It's a product that you release and you sort of put it in the world. These things are going to be constantly iterating. And to the theme of conversations, to me, I think products are conversations. They're conversations that you have with people about how to serve their needs. So right now, given the sort of aspirational sophistication of bots, I would actually suggest that people trend towards being simpler and to make very clear sort of promises about what they can do, and carve out sort of the space around what they can't do. And there's been a lot of conversation in the bot community around just sort of self-description. I'm a bot, these are things that I can do for you. I'm not really that skilled or equipped to do these other things. There is a way actually with some bots where you can turn on, at least on Messenger, wit.ai, which handles a lot of natural language questions. So you can ask it who is George Washington, and the bot will respond with an answer. But that to me actually sort of is moving in a direction that doesn't make a lot of sense, because now you're interacting with a system that has sort of vague contours and boundaries, and so you're left kind of wondering, and then of course frustrated when you try to do something very specific that the bot can't handle. So to try to sort of answer your question more clearly, one, find some fairly conservative but very useful use cases. And second, I would think about a bot as being part of a continuum of interfaces to meet the needs of your customer. So you may still have a fully native app, and it may make sense, depending on your customers and depending on how much they interact with you, to have the app. Like in Uber's case, for example, it makes sense for people to have the Uber app if they're using it like on a very regular basis. Like we optimize the heck out of that experience because we know that experience well, we know it works, we know it converts, and we know it makes sense to people. However, we also want to be available in Slack or in Messenger or in other contexts from a convenience perspective. Or from a new user discovery perspective. You know, if you're having a conversation with your in-laws that are coming to town from like Montana and they've never used Uber before, and you're talking to them in Messenger and you give them your address and there's a button that says get a ride and they tap that button.
Very convenient.
It's super convenient and
Right.
they don't have to download the app, you know, which maybe they'd only use once. So I see it as sort of another really, really useful interface for very fast, you know, tasks or information retrieval. Along a spectrum of complexity,
Right.
you know, and so at some point, you know, someone may need the desktop interface. Like I still love shopping on Amazon.com, like in my full browser with my 2 screens and everything. Every now and then, though, like, you know, it might be interesting if I could talk to like an Amazon bot to ask where my order is.
Right.
That's a lot more convenient for me than opening up the app, trying to find my order history, logging in, like doing all this other stuff that could just be handled through that kind of conversational interface.
Now, at Sonar, we really believe in the hybrid approach, at least where technology with bots currently is, meaning taking an agent and really making them super powered.
A human agent.
A human agent, that's right.
That's also an interesting topic. But yeah.
So I'm wondering, if for an end user, do you think they want to be talking to a bot? Do they want to know they're talking to a bot? And then at a certain point when bots become so good that you really can't tell the difference, are they going to want to know, or are they okay thinking it may or may not be a bot?
I think this is why I think like it's going to be messy for a while. I think that a lot of people are going to think that they can lower all their support costs and customer service costs by just automating everything.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, you may not only lower your costs, but you may actually alienate all of your customers. You have to think about what the overall experience is going to be and whether or not automating certain parts of the service makes you feel more responsive to a customer's questions and concerns, or whether it makes you feel more isolating and unwilling to actually kind of like bring a human element or touch to the interaction. So, you know, for example, when I call the Apple Store, usually it's answered by a bot. Right? It's a human sounding bot, but it's a bot. And it's like, oh, what can I help you with? I can understand natural language things. Like, so tell me what you need. And so I'll sort of talk to it for a while. And I noticed that, I mean, in the slightest hint of frustration on my part or confusion on the bot's part, where it's like, I don't know what's going on. Just hold on a second. Let me get like my supervisor, the human, who's going to come in and, you know, offer you some actual empathy. I think that that's actually very, very important.
Yeah.
And again, it comes back from not thinking about how can I lower, you know, the cost of this interaction because you, my customer, are not that valuable to me. It's how can I make your experience that much better by answering, you know, very basic, sort of straightforward questions. Let's say, what are your hours? When are you open? You know, do you have a sale going on this weekend or whatever? And I don't really want to talk to someone on the phone to get that kind of information. Mm-hmm. Furthermore, I may want to message the bot with maybe a complex task like, hey, I'd like a reservation, you know, for this evening for 4, and then the bot goes off and takes care of that work and then returns the sort of response to me without having to talk to someone or involve someone. So there's kind of like probably a nice gradient of, you know, effort, friction, work, simplicity, complexity that can help you like navigate that question. I don't think all customer service and support should go the way of like bots. I think it's more about how can you help both parties on both ends of the spectrum meet the needs of the other and understand what the intentions are on both sides.
Yeah, and I think you said a really important word, which is empathy. Mm-hmm. Today, it's quite hard to build empathy into bots.
Sure.
And that's why having the agent with the superpower of a bot helping them is really important, because you can have both the empathy and the efficiency of automation. So
yeah, and actually, I mean, on that point, you sort of asked this question before, like, do people care or do they want to talk to bots?
Yeah.
And again, I don't think that's quite the right framing. I think it's more like, how can you be clear about what kind of interaction is about to happen, whether it is a bot or a human, and what are the needs of the person, and how can you meet them as fast as possible? And so I think if ultimately a bot can do a better job than a human, great. If a human's going to understand my needs better because it's complex, then put me in touch with a human.
So it sounds like it's all about setting expectations.
Yeah, and also I should add too that there's a huge opportunity for augmenting human intelligence through bots. So in the case where you have a customer service agent, there may be, a bot in the channel, let's say in a Slack channel, that's only visible to the agent and sort of offering suggested responses or, let's say, product recommendations or things like that that provide context, like a typical kind of CRM tool that the end user doesn't really need to see or doesn't really know about, and yet the bot is facilitating the customer service rep doing a much better job. So bots and humans collaborating to solve people's needs, I think, is totally valid and useful.
Great. So, Chris, what's one industry that you think is in desperate need of a customer communication overhaul, and really could use a messaging strategy? Now, for me, before you give your answer, I absolutely hate calling companies like AT&T and Comcast. It's a really terrible experience with the IVR, press 1 to do this, and then giving your information to multiple agents. How much easier would it be to just send off a text or send off a Facebook message and just have it all done? So that's my answer. I want to hear what you think.
Yeah. I think that those industries for sure are ready for this, but for me, it's really about the government. Ultimately, most of the time, the interactions that I end up having with the government fall back to some fax number that I have to fax in. I haven't had a fax since the 80s, if I even had one then. So they want to have me send things in on physical format and everything. The government, and also because you're dealing with so many agencies, it's always different. The information that they're requesting is always different, and like you said, it's somewhat redundant as well. So in that context and in that space, I think the Estonians are actually sort of moving very quickly forward with a lot of government stuff.
Right.
I'd love to see us actually sort of make some progress there. And the sort of sad irony or potential future for this is that the private companies are going to have a lot of digital identities for the citizens, and ultimately, through those platforms and channels are going to be how people are going to, interact with the government. So I guess that's both good and bad.
Obviously, one government agency is the DMV.
Yeah.
So that's such a horrible experience. Imagine never having to step foot in that office again.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting too. Obviously, with Uber and all the drivers and everything like that, there's just a lot of overhead. And if you imagine just cutting down the cost and friction of sort of being a citizen generally wherever you might be, by being able to, let's say, message in some credentials or some information and just have your registration and all that stuff sort of done for you. We could just sort of make waiting in lines a thing of the past, which would give so much more time back to people.
Yes.
Yeah. So totally.
The last thing, Chris, I want to talk about is something that you launched a few days ago.
Yeah.
Something you launched your own bot, essentially, called the Messina Bot.
That's right.
Why did you do it? Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so the Messina Bot is something that I launched earlier this week, and it's actually the second bot built by a brand new company called OlaBot. And my partner Esther created her own personal bot first called Esther Bot. The thinking for that was essentially to try to make her resume, her LinkedIn profile, more engaging and richer, essentially. And that the bot context was sort of a great choose your own adventure kind of way of actually exploring that information. So she ended up actually submitting her bot to BotCamp, which is a program that BetaWorks is doing, which is funding a bunch of companies this summer. And it turns out she got in, and so she's going to New York to build this thing out. And so Messina Bot is the first bot that her company has produced. And the idea and the inspiration, I think for me goes way back. Having worked on the social web for a long time, having worked on OAuth and all these technologies, the idea has always been to create a more user-centric, sort of individual-centric social web. And with the bot in particular, all of this information gets centralized to the individual. And so the example before where you're asking me what's your location, you're coming to me to find some information. I'm the cardinal point of interaction. Mm-hmm. So with the Messina Bot, I get all these inbound requests via email, via Twitter, via all these different sources. People are asking to set up time with me, to
do a SonarCast.
To do a SonarCast, it's just ridiculous. It doesn't happen that often, but it happens enough where I end up just being very bad at email. And I feel bad because a lot of the time there's information that people want or they need that I don't really need to write myself. It's sort of out there, but it's not accessible. So the bot, if you interact with it, you can go to it at m.me/MessinaBot. it gives you a menu of options, and those menus primarily derive from, again, things that people are constantly asking me. So it's sort of like my personal FAQ, which is kind of interactive. You can ask me to hunt a product for you because I get a lot of requests to do that. You can schedule office hours with me, so it actually looks at a Google calendar that I've set up, and it looks for open slots that I've set, and so you can just book those automatically. So it's sort of like a personal like X.AI or Clara Labs type thing. And then you can also get a bunch of like tips and things like that I've left on like Foursquare. You can get my cocktail recipes that I posted to Bar Notes. So what's great about it is that you don't have to be a user of Foursquare or Bar Notes or any of these other like tools or services to have a need or curiosity about this information. So you come to my bot and you start to explore it, and then you start to see what's there. One of the integrations that's actually super cool that we built that I'm really excited about, and starts to really demonstrate, I think, the future potential of these things to deliver personalized, contextually relevant information, is that if you come to my bot and you connect your Uber account to my bot, so essentially you let my bot know whenever you're in an Uber and where you're going, my bot will send you my Foursquare tips based on your destination.
Very cool.
So you might not have otherwise thought about like pulling open Foursquare and been like, oh, like has Chris been around here, or any of your friends? But now, using this very like specific API that Uber opened up in January, we can now target information to you. Well, my bot can target information to you based on a bunch of relevant contextual information. So it's not just here's a bunch of like random stuff that like Chris has talked about or written about. It's actually very tailored to you and your context.
Now, you're obviously at the cutting edge of all of this, and you're very technically savvy. How do you see less savvy people start to adopt maybe personal bots? Is that going to be a thing? When will my mom have her own bot so I can actually chat with her? She can see where I am all day, which I know she wants to see.
Sure.
When will that happen?
It's a great question. One of the things, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited about bots and like what's going on in this space and conversational software in general, is that it feels like we're sort of at, we've done like a big reset in the capabilities of the context that we're building into. In other words, with messaging, you start out with just plain text. And then from there, you start to add up a little bit of, little information. I mean, if you think back to the origin of the hashtag, which was also in 2007.
Which was you.
Which was me, yes. The idea and the concept was to try to find a way of labeling and grouping conversations over Twitter.
Right.
And Twitter primarily was something that we used over SMS. So if you've come to Twitter like lately, you use it through like the web or through like native apps, you have a very rich experience. You can add photos. But in the beginning, Twitter literally only supported text, 140 characters. So in that space, I had to find a way of like innovating around the idea of how to like label these things. And of course, just adding, the hashtag character before a word suddenly became the way of like denoting groups. So in a similar way, we're at that point where we've got all this technological sophistication in the world, and yet we have this very, very narrow channel through which we can send basic stuff. And we're starting to layer on other pieces of meaning so that we can be more efficient in the way that we communicate. And so to answer your question, I think that because of how accessible this medium is, there's going to be a lot of people, especially young people, that are going to be super excited about having their own bots. And they're going to be the ones that are going to like drive this revolution, just like you and I did like 10, 15 years ago in getting personal homepages and blogs and stuff like that. On the one hand, you could start out and you could like be on someone else's platform, like on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. And those are very rich, media-centric kind of experiences. If instead you want to create an interactive experience that sort of projects part of your personality in a way that is different for everyone that experiences it, as opposed to sort of just a broadcast channel, I think bots provide that opportunity with very lightweight programming. So although it may not be the case that the mass of all people are going to have personal bots like in the next 1 or 2 years, I think increasingly that's going to be what we see across a number of social networks and platforms, just because when your mom's looking for information about you, what you're up to, what you're doing, it would be useful if she could sort of like come to your bot, ask it some questions, maybe schedule a vacation to come visit, and your bot could take care of that for you.
Yeah, so I taught my mom how to text message with me. Now she does it all the time. I taught her how to use Facebook.
Exactly.
Now I'm going to teach her how to use bots.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that.
I mean, again, to go way back again, like in the beginning, in 2004, people didn't know what like a web browser was. And so when we were sort of promoting the idea of a web browser, we had to first figure out a way of helping adults conceptualize what air kind of was, like the air of a web browser. You sort of had Internet Explorer, and you just thought that was the internet. Just like today, people have Facebook, and they're like, that's the internet.
Right.
So increasingly, what I think we'll see is that young people and savvy users will start to interact with these messenger bots and agents and assistants in a way that becomes social. And they'll start to teach their friends that, hey, you can like talk to Virgin America, or you can talk to this, I think, what is it, Text and Chill bot, which gives you like Netflix recommendations. There are these new experiences that are emerging in the messaging space, and they start to become viral just through sort of like peer-to-peer, examples. And so I think that's actually incredibly powerful, because it allows people to then share the story and tell the story of how they discovered the thing and how they used it. And that is a much deeper sort of resonance than trying to like push something out inorganically.
That's great. And your bot can be found at m.me/Messina Bot.
That's right.
Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Chris, for joining us. I really appreciate chatting about bots and messaging in general.
Totally.
It's been really informative.
Yeah.
You can find Chris at Chris Messina on Twitter, and you can also find us on Twitter. And